Hey guys, today I'll show you a horror thriller TV series named Tales from the Crypt, Season 6. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The first story begins with a ruthless lawyer named Geraldine who was brought to a rundown courthouse for reckless driving. The town was a place so obscure it couldn't be found on any map. A man injured in a car accident caught Geraldine's attention. She hastily handed him her business card, completely ignoring the fact that he already had legal representation. Geraldine was notorious for her unscrupulous methods. She would sue anyone for anything as long as her clients paid her, always finding loopholes to secure the outcomes they wanted. Curious about her alleged crime, Geraldine asked the man in the hat beside her. He said he was a car salesman who had secretly altered odometers. Geraldine remarked that he might get 10 years in prison, but the man replied that 10 years would actually be a blessing. The punishments in this town were far more severe. Soon, a loudspeaker summoned the man to courtroom A. He broke into tears, terrified. After he was taken away, Geraldine noticed an old photograph on the wall. Strangely, it featured cars that didn't belong to that era. Just then, a goofy-looking lawyer approached her. He introduced himself as a court-appointed attorney, but Geraldine mocked him ruthlessly, confident in her own ability to defend herself. In court, the man in the hat was dragged away sobbing, though his exact punishment remained unknown. The stern-looking judge was clearly not one to be trifled with. Just as Geraldine prepared to speak, the goofy lawyer burst into the courtroom. He announced that Geraldine was lucky. The judge had agreed to reduce her punishment to 10 lashes. Geraldine scoffed that everyone in New York knows flogging isn't a legal punishment. But this place wasn't like anywhere else. No punishment was off the table. The judge held up Geraldine's license plate, a 5-digit number. By law, only government vehicles could have 5-digit plates. Ordinary citizens had to use 6 digits. Geraldine argued that the space in the middle counted as a digit, effectively making it 6. Just as the judge was about to declare her innocent, the goofy lawyer handed him a document. It detailed a past case where Geraldine had helped a difficult client sue a fair and honest medical equipment company. The company went bankrupt, leaving lots of patients unable to afford life-saving pacemakers. In other words, Geraldine's legal victory had indirectly caused the deaths of hundreds. Yet Geraldine, ever arrogant, simply said that her clients had needs. She took their money and got the job done. If the company couldn't survive, that's just bad luck. Her callousness enraged the judge, who immediately sentenced her to 100 lashes. Geraldine was dragged out of the courtroom, struggling to break free. Outside the punishment chamber, she encountered the man in the hat again. His nose had been cut off as punishment. Screams of agony echoed through the air, and for the first time, Geraldine's bravado began to crumble. Just then, the goofy lawyer appeared once more. The judge had reviewed her license plate and agreed it was valid, overturning her conviction. Without hesitation, Geraldine bolted, desperate to escape this cursed town. But her freedom was short-lived. Guards blocked her path, explaining that by giving the injured man her business card, she had committed the crime of illegal solicitation, a serious offense in this town. Geraldine was dragged into courtroom B. Desperate to save her, the goofy lawyer lied, claiming that Geraldine was mentally ill. The judge, however, was unmoved, saying that mental illness was no excuse for breaking the law, and that trick wouldn't work here. Found guilty once again, Geraldine was sentenced to wear a kang, a heavy wooden collar that locked her hands and neck for an entire year. As her sentence was pronounced, a chorus of tortured wails echoed through the air. Several bloodied figures began to approach her. They were the victims who had died because of the bankrupt medical company. Unable to afford the devices they needed, they had perished in agony. Just as Geraldine's mind teetered on the brink of despair, the goofy lawyer reappeared, revealing that the ghosts were nothing more than hallucinations. He led Geraldine to courtroom C, the strictest court in the town. After repeated pleading, the goofy lawyer managed to have Geraldine's punishment reduced from 10 lashes to immediate execution. Then, the goofy lawyer approached the judge with a proposal. He hoped Geraldine could serve community service instead of facing the death sentence. To everyone's surprise, the judge agreed. Just as Geraldine was about to leave, she realized she was trapped. The goofy lawyer had taken her place in the electric chair. He calmly explained that he had dealt with too many low-level lawyers like Geraldine. He had had enough, and only the electric chair could get him out of this hellhole. With the goofy lawyer's death, Geraldine was forced to wear a wig and glasses. From that moment on, she would replace him as the court-appointed lawyer, dealing with corrupt, money-driven lawyers and high-profile figures just like herself. The story ends here, leaving much unexplained. At the beginning, Geraldine was arrested for reckless driving, but it's possible she actually died in a car accident, and what followed was the trial of her soul. The courtroom might not even be of this world. It could be hell. During her punishment, she saw the souls of many deceased criminals, all waiting for their own final judgment. Geraldine, a lawyer who used legal loopholes to protect herself on Earth, could not escape the judgment of hell. She will continue facing the same kind of greedy people again and again until she fully grasps the weight of her sins. The second story takes place on a Halloween night. Legend says that on this night, spirits mingle among the living to celebrate, and to avoid them standing out too much, people wear strange costumes, dressing up as various ghosts and monsters. At a Halloween party, Carl spotted his ex-girlfriend across the room. Just as he was about to approach her, a friend dressed as Abraham Lincoln stopped him, urging him to let it go since he and his ex had been broken up for so long. Carl put on his mask, but his ex still recognized him. From their conversation, it was clear that Carl had a history of abuse. Even after the breakup, he stalked his attractive ex-girlfriend and did many extreme things to try to win her back. After an argument with his ex, Carl went to the kitchen to vent his anger and encountered Molly, a woman wearing a mask. She seemed very understanding and sympathetic. She told Carl that while his ex was beautiful, she was also very aggressive, and perhaps breaking up with her wasn't such a bad thing for him. Carl felt drawn to Molly and asked what she was dressed as. She replied that she was cosplaying as a body bag and that she herself was the corpse inside. Carl found Molly's response strangely amusing, so he followed her to her place. Her house was a strange building, and before long, they ended up in bed together to perform a smelly hormone yoga session. That night, as Carl slept, he thought he saw a man standing at the foot of the bed, screaming in agony, but the man vanished just as quickly. Carl got up and looked for Molly, but instead, he saw her walking out of a room, looking panicked and holding a saw. Molly explained that she had been working, then handed Carl a drink. He drank it quickly, thinking that he and Molly were now in a proper hormone relationship. He suggested they open up and talk about their families, jobs, and lives, getting to know each other more deeply. But Molly acted strangely cold and aloof, refusing to discuss her family. When Carl asked her to at least take off her mask as a sign of respect, Molly refused. Carl, growing more obsessive, waited until Molly was asleep like a pig, then rifled through her medicine cabinet, only to find that the labels on the medicine bottles had been scratched off. At this point, Carl should have just gotten dressed and left, but instead, he became fixated. He started searching through her purse and various bills, trying to find something that could prove her identity. No wonder his ex had broken up with him. Carl's obsession was undeniable. Feeling dizzy, Carl stumbled into the room where Molly had been working earlier. Inside, there were 3 dusty display cabinets. But what shocked him was the faces displayed inside. One of them was the same man he had seen earlier at the foot of the bed. It seemed the man's ghost was trying to warn him to leave, but Carl ignored it. Instead, he rushed back into the room, grabbed the sleeping Molly, and beat her senseless. During the struggle, Carl used the saw to injure Molly's hand. Driven by his obsession, he insisted on removing her mask to see her true face, but when he did, he found that Molly didn't wear a mask at all. She was born with a horrific face. At that moment, the poison in Carl's body kicked in again. He became paralyzed, unable to move. Molly got up, brushing the dust off her clothes. As Carl screamed in agony, he died under Molly's chainsaw. In this story, Molly has always had a strange appearance and has lived isolated from society. On Halloween night, she emerges from the crowd of costumed revelers hunting for victims. The men she targets are lustful, angry, and obsessive, and they become her sacrifices. Perhaps Molly isn't even human. Her strange existence in that house, which the locals seem to know nothing about, suggests something supernatural. Carl, however, was unaware of her true nature. The third story begins with a man in fat taking a naked bath in the tub while his blonde lover is sitting nearby, smoking like an idiot. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a man appears and strangles the fat man to death. It turns out this man was having an affair with the blonde woman. She yells that the fat man was vulgar and perverted, and she always wished he would die sooner. Afterward, the woman gets dressed, but when she turns around, she's shocked to see the fat man, who was supposed to be dead, has come back to his greasy life and is now choking her. The scene shifts, revealing that this was all part of a comic. The editor-in-chief questions Rolanda about her ridiculous drawing, but Rolanda insists it was a plot twist. The chief was not convinced, saying a fat man coming back to life in a bathtub is not a twist, and no one cares about a fat man's life or death. 2 colleagues watch the scene unfold, silently judging her. Rolanda's creativity, compared to her peers, has turned into utter garbage. She once stood out, but now she's completely drained of inspiration and keeps submitting nonsensical stories. The editor-in-chief, furious, fires her. Rolanda kneels and begs him to reconsider, but she's still thrown out by security. That night, Rolanda returns to the editor-in-chief's office, claiming she's had an idea. She wants to draw a story about a woman who loses her job, mutates, and then finds success. The editor-in-chief scoffs and tells her to get lost with her smelly butt. Frustrated with his dismissive attitude, Rolanda pulls out a gun and shoots him several times. The editor-in-chief dies to meet Satan. Rolanda quickly escapes, but as soon as she reaches the first floor, the police have already surrounded the building. Without warning, they open fire, and Rolanda falls to the ground. But thank goodness it was just a dream. Rolanda wakes up and heads to work as usual. However, the editor-in-chief berates her again for her terrible work and fires her, just like in her dream the night before. Later that night, Rolanda returns to the office once more, claiming she's had a new idea. This time, it's about a woman who loses her job, mutates, and then finds success. The editor-in-chief thinks her idea is worse than the last and pulls out a gun, demanding she kneel. He fears that Rolanda, feeling cornered, might pose a threat. In a struggle, the editor-in-chief accidentally fires his gun and falls dead. Rolanda rushes to the elevator to flee, but as soon as she reaches the first floor, she's confronted by the police. They shoot her again. Rolanda wakes up once more and realizes that everything that happened wasn't a dream. It's something that will actually happen. To prevent the tragedy from repeating, she decides to call in sick and stay home to avoid the editor-in-chief, hoping this will keep her from accidentally killing him. But just as she hangs up the phone, the doorbell rings. It's the editor-in-chief, coming to her apartment to demand her work. He complains about how the magazine's stories have gotten worse. As he vents, his anger mounts, and suddenly he pulls out a gun. The editor-in-chief, overwhelmed by a mental breakdown, shoots himself in front of Rolanda. As Rolanda picks up the gun, the police arrive. This time she's not shot on the spot, but she is sentenced to death for murder. The scene shifts. It turns out everything that just happened was part of a comic. In real life, Rolanda is actually the editor-in-chief of Demon Realm Chronicles, while the so-called editor-in-chief from the story is just a lowly comic artist under her supervision. Furious at being portrayed that way in the comic, Rolanda tears into the artist, calling their work a steaming pile of garbage. The fourth story begins with Nelson, a miserable programmer whose thinning hair makes the audience question his career choice. Too timid for his own good, Nelson's hard work is constantly stolen by his boss, yet he never dares to speak up. Exhausted, he returns home, where his roommate is practically bouncing off the walls. Compared to the dull and reserved Nelson, the roommate is a whirlwind of energy, constantly chattering and unable to sit still. He also has a bad habit of spying on the woman in fat across the street when she changes clothes. Hearing that Nelson's boss stole credit for his work again, the roommate tries to talk some sense into him, urging him to stop being such a pushover. Poor Nelson has no friends. The roommate is his only source of emotional support. But as always, life is full of surprises. One day, a beautiful woman named Jane moves in next door. She borrows Nelson's phone and even invites him to dinner. Strangely, no matter how loudly the roommate calls out from the sidelines, Jane seems completely unaware of his presence. It turns out the roommate isn't real. He's a split personality created by Nelson's loneliness. At dinner, they go to a restaurant and wouldn't expect that the roommate tags along. Since no one else can see him, he boldly makes lewd comments about Jane right in front of Nelson. Ignoring him, Jane mentions that she works as a psychiatrist. The moment the roommate hears this, he freaks out, saying she'll try to separate them for sure. His non-stop chatter eventually pushes Nelson over the edge, who uses sheer willpower to silence him, at least temporarily. After dinner, Nelson and Jane say goodnight and head home. Jane's arrival marks the beginning of a rift in Nelson and the roommate's 30-year friendship. Furious at being ignored, the roommate storms out and disappears, no matter how much Nelson calls for him. Days pass. Once again, Nelson finds himself tormented by his boss at work. Just when he's about to break, the roommate unexpectedly reappears in his office. With a smug grin, he says he hasn't seen Jane since that night, and he thinks she's been avoiding him on purpose. But he has thought it over. At the end of the day, he's the only real friend Nelson got. Nelson and his roommate move back in together. The roommate still spends his days spying on the chubby woman across the street through binoculars, watching her change clothes. It's unclear what kind of taste that is, but life is cozy for them. That is, until Jane knocks on Nelson's door one day. It turns out Jane's been sick for several days and has been bedridden, but now that she's recovering, she invites Nelson to dinner and possibly to a hormone therapy later. Nelson, the ever-weakling when it comes to women, eagerly ditches the roommate and goes on the date. What they ate doesn't really matter. What's important is that they've only known each other for less than a week, and yet the conversation quickly turns to the bedroom. The roommate reappears at the foot of the hormone-smelly bed. He's furious with jealousy and demands that Nelson choose between him and Jane. No matter how hard Nelson tries to use his mind to push the roommate away, it doesn't work. The The roommate even manifests Nelson's childhood nun teacher, the school bully who tormented him, and his oppressive boss. All of them taunt Nelson, calling him an unlikable failure. Under the roommate's brainwashing, Nelson even picks up a pillow, intending to smother Jane. Just as Nelson is about to carry out the deed, Jane opens her eyes. Suddenly, Nelson snaps back to reality, throws the pillow aside, and rushes home. But the roommate isn't done with him. He knows Nelson's true personality is rejecting him, so if they can't coexist, he'll just replace him entirely. The once timid Nelson is gone. In his place is a darker, more assertive version of him. He marries Jane and his career flourishes. His former boss is now his subordinate. The CEO praises Nelson for his transformation and believes he'll soon be promoted to vice president. This might actually be a good ending, but since the whole story revolves around multiple personalities, who's to say Jane isn't one of Nelson's split personalities? Perhaps because of his weakness, the roommate formed to give him strength, and because of his loneliness, he created Jane as his ideal girlfriend. The fifth story takes place in a blind asylum where a blind man wakes up late at night and heads to the bathroom, but finds that the door is mysteriously bricked shut. At the end of the hall, the director has scattered a bunch of glass marbles on the floor. He enjoys watching the blind people slip and fall. The director is a sick, twisted man who derives pleasure from torturing the blind residents. His younger brother, Benny, often feels guilty but is too weak to stand up to his brother's authority. Sheila, a beautiful young blind woman, is the newest resident. The director tells her that in this world of blind people, he is the king, and she should learn to behave accordingly. Sheila isn't having it. The director sends his brother to escort her back to her dorm, and during the walk, Benny reveals that their mother was also blind. He doesn't know why his brother despises blind people so much. Wanting to escape the asylum, Sheila tries to seduce Benny using her sexy body, but he rejects her hormone advances, afraid that his brother will lock him up in a mental institution. Because the dorm is next to the railway, the building shakes every time a train passes. The blind man tells Sheila that the trains come every hour and they're very punctual. Sheila suggests they all escape together, but the man warns her not to do anything foolish. Someone tried escaping last week, but the director's dog bit off his legs. Reluctantly, Sheila goes to the director's office, hoping to do something he asks so she can leave. But the director tells her just something isn't enough and he wants everything. Furious, the director kicks Sheila back to the dorm. Sheila didn't come away empty-handed either. She managed to steal a small folding knife from the director's office. However, this tiny knife couldn't stand up to the director's vicious dog. Instead, it made him more cautious, and he added an extra lock to their dormitory door. That wasn't all. The director, to punish everyone, reduced their meals from 2 a day to just 1. The room was drafty, and they shivered from the cold. The old bastard even turned off the heating. Benny wanted to do something for everyone, but how much better was his situation than the blind people's? In order to get better treatment, Sheila went to the director's office, pretending to pledge allegiance to him. But taking advantage of his guard being down, she delivered a devastating kick to his smelly sausage. At his age, he was probably already close to being infertile, even without Sheila's kick. Benny, who was usually cowardly, suddenly found the strength to protect Sheila and knock the director out cold. Time passed, and the director woke up in a cold and damp room. He kept pounding on the door, shouting for Benny to help him. It wasn't until nightfall that the door opened by itself. Before him was a narrow passage, and after taking only a few steps, the director let out a chicken scream. Both sides of the passage were lined with razor-sharp blades. A train passed by, shaking the entire building, and the director was accidentally sliced a few times. He finally managed to get through the blade-filled corridor, only to find Benny waiting for him with his vicious dog. Years ago, the cruel director had murdered his own mother just to inherit her wealth. Benny had never been able to forgive him for that. Now, he finally gathered the courage to sever ties with his brother. After all, they shared the same last name, but from now on, Benny would be the new head of the blind asylum. Surely no one would oppose him. The vicious dog forced the director back toward the blade-filled corridor. The devious dog poured a large amount of glass marbles into the path, making the director slip and suffer the pain of falling. Next came the closing of the door, the turning off of the lights, and the release of the dog. The sixth story begins with Martin, who is the newly appointed fire inspector. He walks into a nightclub alone to flex his bald head, and it's rumored that his irresponsible daughter once worked there as a stripper. Martin storms into the office, furious, and throws several nude photos of his daughter on the nightclub owner's desk. He demands an explanation for why the owner sent these photos to him. The owner, looking innocent, denies having anything to do with it. Since Martin is the new fire inspector, and in order to ensure his nightclub's operations stay smooth, the owner plans to bribe Martin Martin, but Martin is a man of integrity. He refuses to be bought. After Martin leaves, the nightclub owner quickly gathers his staff to figure out what to do. Meanwhile, Martin returns home to find his daughter, Haley, in a heated argument with her new boyfriend. The boyfriend storms out without a word. Haley tells Martin that due to her poor performance, the university has expelled her. The tuition at her new school is ridiculously expensive, more than Martin's entire annual salary. Martin is a soft-hearted father, and despite his disappointment, he comforts his daughter, assuring her he'll find a way. Right now, he just hopes she'll get back together with the boyfriend he introduced her to. That boyfriend is from a good family, and his background is clean, but Haley tells him she already broke up with him. Haley explains his parents actually had the nerve to look down on her for her bad haircut and stripper experience. She prefers hanging out with people from the nightclub because they never judge her. Despite her rebellious attitude, Haley won't listen to any advice. Martin only wants to send her back to college, but the huge tuition fee is a problem. Confused and desperate, Martin seeks advice from the former fire inspector. The former inspector tells him how they struggled through the ranks from firefighters to fire inspectors, enduring countless injuries and hardships. The modest monthly salary seems great, but it doesn't even come close to matching their sacrifices. If Martin wants to gather the money for his daughter's tuition, then he might as well accept a bribe without hesitation. After all, the world isn't just black and white. There are many gray areas. So Martin accepts the nightclub owner's bribe without guilt. Before leaving, he warns the owner to stay away from his daughter. But the owner still maintains his innocence, insisting he wasn't the one who sent the photos and has never had any inappropriate contact with Haley. Martin gives the money to his daughter so she can continue her studies without breaking up with her clean-cut boyfriend. Martin envisions a bright future for Haley, and he puts a golden bracelet on her wrist. It's his late wife's keepsake. After Haley leaves, Martin finds the delirious addict. Martin's life has always been above board, and no matter what, accepting bribes is a stain on his record. He lures the addict with drugs and suggests he find a way to get rid of the nightclub owner. Martin figures that if the owner is dead, his bribery will never be discovered. That night, Martin receives a call. The addict has set the nightclub on fire. What Martin didn't expect was that the surviving owner tells him that his daughter was inside the nightclub. Looking at his daughter's bracelet, Martin can't believe it. Haley hadn't followed his advice and reconciled with her boyfriend. She had gone back to the nightclub to have fun. If he hadn't been so focused on covering up his own dirty deed, his daughter wouldn't have died. Full of regret, Martin takes his own life. After Martin's death, he receives a voicemail from Haley. It turns out she never went to the nightclub and she never planned to go to college. She had deceived her father into giving her the money for tuition, then ran off with her boyfriend. Her boyfriend is one of the nightclub owner's men. From the camera in his hand, it's clear he's the one who sent the photos of Haley to Martin. He also stole the bracelet and gave it to the nightclub owner. It was him who caused Martin's corruption and eventual suicide. Yet Haley remains blissfully unaware, happily living with her lover, carefree. The seventh story begins with Felix and Aaron are both popular fighters, and their skills are nearly equal, with several matches that ended in ties. In front of the cameras, the two men are constantly at odds, but it's not just them. Felix's wife and Aaron's wife are always ready to argue at the drop of a hat. In fact, both the two wives are fighters too, and their combat skills are on par with their husbands. However, men in the fight business earn 2 to 3 times more than the women, so the wives decided to retire and let their husbands make the money. Rumor has it that Hollywood is planning to make an action movie, and both fierce wives pushed hard to get Felix and Aaron a shot at the lead roles. But there could only be one male lead. Neither wife wanted their husband to lose, so they began training them at home, threatening with slaps if there were any complaints. Aaron's wife took it a step further. She not only forced her husband to train every day, but also used the money he earned to support a younger man. Meanwhile, the event organizers were brainstorming ideas for an epic match. By chance, one of them saw the video of Felix and Aaron fighting, and the two fighters' techniques were impressive, but they had never been able to decide a winner. The heated exchanges between their wives gave the organizer an idea, so he called the two wives, suggesting they organize a match in Malaysia style with no rules and no restrictions on weapons, continuing until one of the fighters is either incapacitated or dead. The two wives, both former champions, knew how dangerous such a match would be, but the organizer promised them that the winner would land the lead role in the movie, and even if they lost, they would still earn $10 million. The two wives, who had never gotten along, saw this as a chance to prove who was superior. So they took matters into their own hands and signed the agreement for their husbands, regardless of the consequences. If their husbands died, they'd just get new ones, no big deal. Pride couldn't be sacrificed. When Felix and Aaron found out, they were shocked. The Malaysia-style rules could easily cost someone their life. How could their wives sign them up for such a dangerous match without even discussing it? Besides, they were already rich. Why risk it all for more? But the two wives said they were not asking for their opinion, but telling them to compete and win that title. Under their wives' threats, Felix and Aaron had no choice but to comply. To be honest, Felix and Aaron are impressive fighters with a Street Fighter vibe. As usual, before the match, the fighters need to provoke each other in front of the press, throwing insults and making the match more dramatic. But the wives were even more into it than their husbands. If it weren't for the tight security, they would have probably fought each other on the spot. After the interview, Felix and Aaron started talking about their lives. In reality, after fighting each other so many times, they'd come to respect each other. They were both tired of the brutal competitions and had considered retirement long ago. But their fierce wives were just too strong, always forcing them into matches, and it had become unbearable. They didn't want to continue living like this, so they started planning their revenge on their wives. That night, Felix's wife received an anonymous phone call. The voice on the other end told her that Aaron's wife had tampered with the match to help her husband win. At the same time, Aaron's wife received the same call. After hanging up, both women sneaked their way to the ring, where they immediately went at each other. When enemies meet, sparks fly. They began accusing each other of being underhanded, even criticizing each other for things like breast augmentation and plastic surgery. The two wives started fighting right there in the ring. As they continued, they noticed cameras positioned outside the ring. It turned out that the real stars of this match weren't Felix and Aaron, but their wives. After all, women fighting is way more entertaining than men fighting. The wives weren't just ripping clothes and pulling hair like typical catfights. They were using weapons and fighting like real pros. No wonder their husbands never dared to oppose them. Felix and Aaron watched the scene with interest, enjoying the show as their wives beat each other up. Felix remarked that it's getting pretty intense. What if someone ends up dead? Aaron replied that was exactly what they wanted. The live broadcast of the match was a huge hit. The event organizers were extremely satisfied and began negotiations with the producers. Felix and Aaron were offered the lead roles in the movie. The eighth story begins with Clyde, who is a fugitive, desperately running through the woods as a group of police chase after him. Just as he's about to be cornered, he knocks on the door of a mountain cabin. The homeowner is an elderly woman. Seeing Clyde wounded, her maternal instincts kick in, and she kindly lets him in. Clyde tells her that he was in a relationship with the sheriff's daughter, but the sheriff disapproved. To keep them apart, the sheriff tried to have him killed in the dead of night. The elderly woman listens and thinks this guy is not only handsome, but also romantic. Just then, the sheriff knocks on the door. He anxiously tells the woman they're searching for a convicted criminal with a tattoo on his neck, someone who is extremely dangerous and has a history of torturing elderly women like her. Clearly, Clyde had lied. He was a predator. But despite this, the old woman denies ever seeing him and manages to send the sheriff's smelly butt away with a few well-placed words. Once the police leave, Clyde reveals his true intentions. He plans to rob the old woman and escape, but there's no car or phone in the cabin. Clyde despises the elderly and considers killing her with the butt of his gun. However, the old woman isn't intimidated. She tells him to put his gun down. He is in the middle of nowhere, and if he wants to escape, he'll need her help. After thinking for a moment, Clyde decides to spare her life for now. The old woman wonders why Clyde seems to hate old people so much, but he explains that when he gets old, he plans to end his life by suicide, as he believes life will no longer be worth living. The elderly woman continues to compliment Clyde's looks as she shakily climbs upstairs. Not long after, Clyde sees a beautiful young woman on the second floor. It turns out the elderly woman isn't living alone. In the middle of nowhere, Clyde's excitement grows, like a fly seeing dung, a wolf spotting meat, or a scoundrel meeting a flirty girl. He eagerly plans to climb upstairs and sleep with the young woman. The woman introduces herself and stops Clyde from coming upstairs. Instead, she asks him to bring her a drink. But when Clyde returns with the drink, he's shocked to find the old woman wearing the young woman's clothes. The old woman shared a sorrowful love story with Clyde. It turned out that her husband had been a soldier. Many years ago, her husband went off to war, and for months, there was no news from him. She assumed he had died in battle. At that moment, a handsome young man visited her, and feeling lonely, she couldn't resist her hormone desires and slept with him. The very next morning, her husband returned, furious. He was about to kill her lover on the spot, but to protect him, she shot and killed her husband. Before he died, her husband cursed her, saying that no young man would ever again climb the stairs to her bed. She would never again be able to use her youthful beauty to please men. In other words, she would be a young woman upstairs, but an old woman downstairs. As for Clyde, he was a handsome man downstairs, but would turn into an old man upstairs. However, what her husband didn't consider was that they could still sneak around and have an affair on the stairs. That's quite clever, and should be given an award for that. Just as they were about to get intimate, the police knocked on the lady's door. She quickly told Clyde to go upstairs because once he aged, the police wouldn't recognize him. She lied, claiming Clyde was her husband. The police dog sniffed Clyde's scent, but also sensed the magic of the stairs, hesitating to go up. Meanwhile, Clyde, frightened by the dog, rushed up to the 3rd floor. The sheriff apologized to the lady and left with the dog. After the sheriff departed, she rushed upstairs to stop Clyde, but to her surprise, he had already reached the 3rd floor, terrified of dying. The curse on the 3rd floor was even stronger than the 2nd, and in an instant, Clyde aged so much that he couldn't move, collapsing to the floor, unable to take care of himself. He called out the lady's name, but when she arrived on the 3rd floor, she had turned into an infant. She didn't have the strength to drag him back downstairs. Clyde remembered his earlier words about ending his life through suicide when he grew old, but now he couldn't even do that. All he could do was lie there, quietly waiting for death. The 9th story begins with a married woman named Janet who was preparing breakfast for her husband. He was always dressed in a suit, busy with work and keeping mysterious. After sending him off, Janet went out to buy ingredients for dinner. When she entered her house, she was surprised to find an unexpected guest sitting inside. The woman introduced herself as a police officer investigating Janet's husband. Janet, terrified, quickly picked up the phone, intending to warn her husband to come home early. But the woman snatched the phone from her hand, saying that Janet's husband was a very dangerous assassin and that she couldn't warn him in advance, or he might escape. Enraged, Janet punched the woman, trying to stop her from catching her husband. As she stepped outside, 2 strange men knocked her out with a stun gun. When Janet came to, she saw the woman arguing with 2 colleagues. It turned out that the colleagues believed the woman was an idiot for being easily deceived by a housewife. Even Janet thought the woman wasn't very smart. Who would believe a police officer would break into a house like this? The woman angrily slapped Janet, saying she had once worked with Janet's husband. It turned out that Janet's husband was a former CIA agent responsible for handling special operations for the federal government, like secretly assassinating people for the president. In simple terms, Janet's husband was an assassin. Because he knew too many government secrets, he feared the organization might try to eliminate him, so he quietly left the agency. He changed his identity through plastic surgery and a new name, eventually marrying Janet, who remained unaware of his past and settled in this peaceful town. Janet couldn't believe her husband was such a person. She pulled out their wedding photo and said her husband was big and burly, totally not like the person in this photo. The woman told Janet that for a CIA agent, getting plastic surgery or changing their hairstyle was nothing. Her husband could even change his fingerprints and voice. But no matter how perfect the disguise, it couldn't fool her and her colleagues. The female agent ordered her colleagues to take Janet to the basement to deal with her. The basement was filled with exercise equipment, and in a desperate bid to survive, Janet seduced one of the agents. As the agent protested that he's a secret agent and they have principles, he took off his smelly pants after hesitating for 2 seconds. Thinking quickly, Janet activated the treadmill and the agent, caught halfway through undressing, tripped and fell. His tie got caught in the treadmill and he was strangled to death to meet underpants Satan. Upstairs, the female agent felt uneasy and went to check the basement. With her sharp instincts, she stood on the stairs and pulled out her gun, but she twisted her ankle and rolled down the stairs, causing the gun to land in a paint can. Meanwhile, Janet managed to escape to the 2nd floor, planning to hide in the bathroom. But as luck would have it, she ran into another agent there. Without hesitation, Janet grabbed a high heel and stabbed him to death. Just as she was about to leave, the female agent pointed a gun at Janet's head, insulting her and revealing that she had once been romantically involved with Janet's husband. She'd set off fireworks to provoke Janet, but instead, Janet dropped a bombshell. She made a man's voice, suggesting that she was actually the assassin wanted by the agents. In a swift move, she delivered a deadly scissor kick and killed the female agent. Just like the agent had told Janet earlier, agents could not only change their looks and identity, but also their fingerprints and voices. Clearly, being a harmless housewife was the best way for him to hide his true identity. After dealing with the bodies, Janet set the table for dinner. When her husband and guests praised her cooking, no one suspected she was a cold-blooded assassin. The 10th story begins with Ray, who was cruising down the street through the heavy rain, singing along in his car and casually lighting a cigarette. He arrived at a secluded inn, and the innkeeper, upon hearing that his father was the infamous landlord, broke into a cold sweat. It turned out that Ray's father had left behind a lavish mansion, and Ray had come to claim it. The eerie innkeeper warned him, telling him that 20 years ago, a massive fire had destroyed the house. But strangely, every day since, lights and music could be heard from the abandoned house, as though someone was holding a party there. She advised him not to go. Curiosity killed the cat, and the more mysterious something is, the more it piques Ray's interest. He was determined to see what was so strange about the old mansion. On the way, Ray recalled his father. His father was wealthy, owning the mansion and land, but what he didn't expect was that his father had left a will before his death, stating that the house and land should be donated to charity for Ray's own good. Furious, Ray strangled his father to death, thinking that the inheritance would be his alone. As his father died, he weakly cursed Ray, warning him that the mansion was cursed and that he should never return. Ray, ever rebellious, didn't listen to a word of advice. Once the memories faded, Ray finally reached the old mansion. He mustered up his courage and pushed open the door. What he saw left him stunned. A group of young men and women had taken over the house, holding a raucous party without a care in the world. Ray, furious, demanded to know why they occupied his old house. He revealed his identity, claiming this is his house. To his surprise, the moment he introduced himself, the young people got even more excited, cranking up the music and dancing wildly in TikTok style. In the crowd, a stunning beauty approached to flex her skinny figure and started chatting with Ray. Her name was Josie, and she handed Ray a drink. She told him that the people here had been waiting for him for a long time, but Ray thought she was joking and didn't pay much attention. The two's friendly behavior quickly caught the eye of Josie's boyfriend, who obviously was jealous. Josie, however, wasn't bothered and pulled Ray up to the quiet second floor. She lit an oil lamp, complaining that it was too hot upstairs, and started to take off her clothes. You wouldn't believe it, but Ray didn't even try to stop her. He just followed her lead. Just as they were getting into it, Josie's boyfriend barged in downstairs, and without saying a word, he started beating Ray, trying to prevent him from sleeping with his girlfriend. Ray, trying to explain, said that it's his girlfriend who said she was hot and wanted to take her clothes off. During the argument, Ray pulled out a handgun from his pocket and shot the man dead. Josie, terrified, screamed in panic and in a chicken voice, but Ray wasn't done. He smothered her with a pillow and killed her too, all over some clothes coming off, and now there were 2 lives lost. To cover his tracks, Ray poured kerosene over the bodies and the stairs, preparing to set the place on fire. But to his shock, both Josie and her boyfriend, now dead, were standing downstairs, staring at him. Their faces were bruised, and the once glamorous party guests had all dropped their good looks, revealing horrific burns. It turned out that 20 years ago, Ray's father had invited his friends over for a party at the old mansion. After a few rounds of drinks, Ray's father tried to assault Josie in a fit of madness. What happened next was exactly like what Ray had just experienced. Josie and her boyfriend, trying to stop Ray's father's violent act, were both killed. To cover up his crime, Ray's father set fire to the mansion and their bodies. The 15 young people partying downstairs at the time were also burned alive. Their souls never left. Every night, they held a party, waiting for Ray's father to come back and pay for his sins. But instead of Ray's father, they got his equally brutal son, Ray. In the end, Ray was doused with kerosene and burned alive by the vengeful spirits, bringing this tragic tale to a close. The 11th story begins with a radio host, Gary, whose head is bald but his voice was deep and elegant as he hosted a talk show that tackled somewhat risque topics. Unfortunately, due to his poor driving skills, the show's ratings had plummeted, and with his assistant not cooperating well, Gary fired his chubby assistant in a fit of frustration. His ratings were far behind his competitors, and it was rumored that even his sponsors had fled overnight. Gary's sister, who also happened to be the radio station's boss, was furious and was planning to move Gary's show to the late-night slot where no one would be listening. By the way, how did he manage to look older than his own sister? His sister was strong-willed and always kept Gary from having any chance of turning things around. But this time, his sister introduced a beautiful new assistant, Valerie. Apparently, Valerie was a fan of Gary, and at first, Gary wasn't too thrilled about her joining. However, to his surprise, Valerie was a natural. Just a few words from her, and the atmosphere in the studio was electric. The phone lines lit up, and Gary, who had lost his passion for the job, suddenly found his groove again. With the show's popularity soaring, the two of them, having only known each other for a few days, quickly began a romance. However, as time went on, Valerie grew dissatisfied with the nature of the show. She wanted Gary to talk about healthier, more serious topics. With Valerie's suggestion, Gary began a psychological interview segment on his show. Valerie encouraged Gary to talk about his mother. His mother had always been a sensitive topic for him, but Gary reluctantly agreed. He described her as a powerful woman who owned several radio stations, yet after her death, she left him with only a small station and just half of the shares. Since then, Gary had been oppressed by his sister, unable to turn things around no matter how hard he tried. Gary's frustration grew, and he became so emotional that he ended up smashing his mother's portrait. His His sister, who had been listening the entire time, was beyond furious. It turned out that before her death, his mother had set a rule. No one was allowed to speak ill of her on the air, but Gary had come very close to cursing her out. His sister was furious and planned to cancel all of Gary's programs. Gary, however, didn't back down, telling her to cancel them if she wanted, and he would just find another station. If they didn't want him here, he would go somewhere else. But his sister wasn't planning to fire him. She wouldn't let him continue his work, and worse, she was going to hold his contract hostage, preventing him from working anywhere else. She basically planned to ruin his career and trap him. Gary couldn't understand why he was cursed with such a family. Just when his career was starting to take off, his sister destroyed it all. Gary and Valerie were both angry and frustrated. Trying to lighten the mood, Valerie jokingly asked if he was going to kill his sister. To Valerie's surprise, Gary took the suggestion seriously. By killing his sister, he would inherit the entire radio station. Gary asked Valerie for help. He planned to record a 20-minute segment in advance to play live, during which he would sneak into his sister's house and kill her, then return to continue the broadcast. That way, he'd have the perfect alibi. Valerie didn't want to get involved, but couldn't refuse Gary's persistent request and reluctantly agreed. That night, Valerie played Gary's pre-recorded segment live on air. Meanwhile, Gary quietly snuck into his sister's bedroom. Just as he was about to attack his sleeping sister, she suddenly turned around, gun in hand, pointing it straight at him. It turned out the entire situation was a trap set by Valerie. She was tired of being just a small-time assistant and wanted to replace Gary as the new host. So, she helped Gary's sister devise this plan. The idea was for Gary's sister to kill him in self-defense, removing him as a threat. Gary's sister admitted that while Gary was talented, he had been an accident. Neither she nor their mother ever liked him. With the sound of a gunshot, Gary was killed by his sister in self-defense after his failed attempt to attack. From the moment he was born, Gary had always been disliked, and until the moment of his death, he never understood why no one ever liked him. Valerie tearfully announced Gary's death to the audience, and from that day on, she would replace him as the new host. The 12th story begins with Richard and Charlie being the new night shift security guards at the morgue, tasked with the responsibility of overseeing the deceased. After receiving their instructions from the boss, who emphasized that even the smallest item must be accounted for, the two are left with a sense of unease, for their boss's words carry the weight of a threat. Richard silently raises his middle finger, while Charlie advises him to stay grounded and avoid trouble. At that very moment, a doctor crosses paths with Richard and Charlie. The doctor, well-dressed and confident, offers the two a deal. Help him move a corpse, and he'll pay them $500 each. The two, motivated by greed, eagerly agree and assist the doctor in transporting the body to the basement, which serves as the doctor's secret laboratory. The doctor was once dismissed from the hospital for unethical practices and has turned to grave robbing, convinced that he can extract the soul from the body by targeting a gland located in the spine. He hopes that capturing a soul will bring him fame and fortune, but after conducting numerous dissections, he's been unable to find any trace of a soul, driving him to the brink of madness. Once the dissection is complete, the doctor asks the two to help him dispose of the body. Richard, dissatisfied with the payment, demands an extra $100, raising the price to $600, which Charlie reluctantly agrees to. They load the body into the trunk of their car and prepare to drive it out to the countryside. But as they travel, Charlie becomes increasingly uneasy, his conscience weighing heavily on him. He mutters that they shouldn't be doing this, but Richard ignores his smelly bullshit and insists that as long as there's money to be made, he'll do anything. As they carry the body, Charlie suddenly experiences a terrifying vision. The body comes to life and grabs him by the neck. Fortunately, it's just a hallucination, and Richard snaps him out of it, tossing the body into a dry well. By the end of the night, they've made over $1,000, feeling satisfied with their illicit earnings. The following morning, their boss, furious, wakes them up with a scolding. He's discovered that the body has gone missing and promptly fires them on the spot. Richard, in a panic, argues with the boss, but in doing so, he unknowingly reveals mud on his shoes, an odd detail considering he's supposed to be guarding the morgue, not traipsing through dirt. The boss immediately realizes that Richard and Charlie have been stealing the bodies. The situation escalates, and when the boss threatens to call the police, Richard attacks him with a flashlight, injuring him severely. Charlie, horrified by the violence, tries to reason with Richard, pointing out that they were just stealing a corpse, not committing murder. suggesting they seek medical help for the wounded boss. Richard, however, has other plans. He drags the injured boss to the doctor's laboratory, where the doctor believes he has finally discovered a soul when he examines the boss's nearly lifeless body. He sees a fleeting light, the soul, but it vanishes just as quickly, proving that souls exist only in the living. Once a person dies, their soul departs immediately. Charlie, now appalled by the unscientific practices of the doctor, chastises him, claiming that stealing souls in the name of science is immoral. The doctor and Richard, realizing that Charlie's conscience might pose a threat to their lucrative operation, know that it's time to eliminate him. In his typical cryptic manner, the doctor hints that someone as kind-hearted as Charlie likely has an exceptionally vibrant soul. Understanding the implication, Richard gives Charlie a bottle of liquor laced with sleeping pills. Charlie, unaware of the danger, drinks it, and as he falls unconscious, Richard and the doctor prepare to dissect him. Just like that, the once innocent Charlie is sent to the operating table, a tragic victim of his own misplaced sense of morality. The doctor swiftly took the scalpel in hand and, with a quick incision, extracted the glowing soul from Charlie's spine. Filled with excitement, the doctor placed Charlie's soul into a jar. Without his soul, Charlie was nothing but an empty shell. To make disposal easier, Richard chopped Charlie's body into pieces and dumped it into the dry well. With this gruesome task completed, Richard became the doctor's true assistant. However, Richard had learned the secret of soul extraction and had no intention of continuing his partnership with the doctor. Instead, he decided to use the same method on the doctor, forcefully pressing him onto the operating table while he was still alive. As the doctor struggled, there was a sudden noise at the door. To his surprise, Charlie, somehow alive again, had crawled out of the well. He slammed his head against the wall and killed the heartless doctor before binding Richard to the operating table. Richard begged for his shitty life, pleading with him not to do this since he was a good person. Charlie had once been a good person, but they had stolen his soul. Now, Charlie was nothing more than a vengeful zombie, sustained by his hatred and unwilling to fall. As Richard screamed in horror, Charlie took his soul, leaving Richard's fate a chilling mystery. Studies have shown that many patients who have survived near-death experiences report vivid visions of bright lights and a strong sense of leaving their own body. While these claims have not been fully substantiated by science, the question of whether the soul truly exists remains an unsolved mystery. The 13th story takes place in a remote bar in Alaska where the tough, sharp-tongued bar owner despised poachers. Yet on this particular day, two poachers walked into her establishment. They are Burroughs and Parker. The two were discussing plans to hunt the local grizzly bears when the owner told them that her husband Jerry had once been a poacher himself. He was arrested and spent a long time in jail, and the one who reported him to the authorities was none other than the owner herself. Her hatred for poachers ran deep. Now she planned to report Burroughs and Parker as well. Casual as ever, she lit a cigar and slowly dialed the police. But before she could say a word, Parker shot her dead and sent her to meet Satan. The two poachers found Jerry, only to be shocked to learn that Jerry was a woman. As it turned out, Jerry had also been a poacher, and Burroughs and Parker decided to take her along on their grizzly bear hunt. If they succeeded, they promised to generously pay Jerry $100, but she scoffed, thinking that it's far from enough. Just then, Burroughs noticed a Purple Heart medal hanging nearby. It turned out that Jerry had once been a soldier. Coincidentally, Burroughs and Parker were both veterans as well, Burroughs a colonel and Parker a sergeant. After their military service, they had turned to a life of crime, including poaching. Burroughs' fall from a colonel to a poacher was, to say the least, tragic. As they chatted, Burroughs revealed that he and Jerry had served together in Iraq. During one mission, Burroughs had ordered artillery fire, only for it to hit their own troops, wounding Jerry in the process. Despite that, Burroughs had been Jerry's superior, and as soldiers, she had no choice but to obey his orders. Jerry led the two men to a place frequently visited by grizzly bears, an abandoned military base. After the army evacuated, the area became a playground for local children. That was until several children mysteriously vanished years ago, prompting the residents to forbid kids from coming here. The base gradually fell into disrepair. Jerry had recently found some grizzly bear tracks, so Burroughs decided to venture out alone to investigate. He left Parker and Jerry behind to handle things, and the two set about setting traps while casually chatting. Taking advantage of Burroughs' absence, Jerry started to seduce Parker using her sexy body. She told him that grizzly bears were an endangered species, and a bear's gallbladder could fetch over $60,000. She then suggested they work together to kill Burroughs and split the profit. However, despite her advances, Parker remained composed. Burroughs had been listening outside the door the whole time. Burroughs found the body of a grizzly bear, suggesting that someone had already killed it before they arrived. Parker pulled out his gun and demanded answers from Jerry. Just then, the sound of monstrous growls echoed from the base, and the two rushed toward the source, guns drawn. As they moved deeper, the growls morphed into eerie, baby-like cries. They entered a room to find it filled with strange creatures, large and small, hanging upside down. The crying came from these creatures. Terrified, Burroughs and Parker began to back away, only to find a helpless little girl standing behind them. Her body temperature was shockingly low, certainly not that of a living person. As it turns out, the girl was not alive at all. Meanwhile, the creatures in the room began to hatch. Jerry slowly emerged from the shadows. These creatures were vampire eggs, and it turned out that years ago, Burroughs' order to fire artillery had killed Jerry's comrades in a friendly fire incident. Jerry had miraculously survived, but the toxins in the artillery shell had poisoned her body. After her discharge, she had ended up in this vampire city. Jerry's blood was toxic to vampires, which allowed her to live in harmony with them and occasionally help them find prey. Burroughs' command had ruined Jerry's life, and now it was her turn to get revenge. With their lives on the line, Parker, who had always been loyal, shot Burroughs, leaving him to the vampires while Parker tried to escape. But as he fled, he accidentally stepped into one of his own traps and screamed in agony all the way back to the bar. Cursing, he muttered to himself that it would be daylight soon, and the vampires would turn to ash when the sun rises. At that moment, the bar's owner, now a vampire, leapt at him. Parker, a former soldier with formidable fighting skills, quickly dispatched the vampire owner. But before he could catch his breath, Jerry burst in with a horde of vampires. It turned out that the bar was in a remote part of Alaska, and with it being the polar night, the sun wouldn't rise for another 2 months. Parker, now surrounded, became the vampire's next meal. The two men, who had come to poach, had unknowingly become the prey, an ironic and cruel twist of fate. The 14th story begins with an artist named Willa, who covers both herself and her young boyfriend in red paint. Willa doesn't particularly like her boyfriend, so after their date, she hurriedly sends his smelly butt away, promising to see him the next day when he smells better. The truth is, Willa is already married to Loudon, a factory owner who adores her. Yet Willa is cold and distant toward him. On TV, Loudon's ad for his factory's new, fully automated soap machine is airing. The machine can instantly produce a whole box of soap just by adding raw materials and starting it up. Loudon suffers from acid reflux, which requires him to take medication to neutralize his stomach acid. Willa, who used to design soap packaging for her husband's company, is now out of touch, and her designs are becoming increasingly outdated. Loudon wants her to create a fresh new look for the company. Worse, Willa's provocative, violent artwork has limited her appeal, and her market is shrinking. When Willa gets home, she learns that her husband has signed a deal with one of her competitors for the packaging design. This pushes Willa to the brink of a breakdown. If even her closest husband won't appreciate her work, who will? Loudon suggests that Willa stay home and focus on her art, but at that moment, Willa demands a divorce, wanting to take half of the family's wealth. However, Loudon is already aware of her affair with the young man. Despite this, he cares deeply for Willa. Even with his life falling apart, he hopes she'll take some time to focus on herself at home, without constantly chasing after fleeting desires. So, what does Willa do when her affair is discovered? She decides to kill her husband. In a frenzy, she picks up a giant soap and smashes it into Loudon's head until he loses consciousness. Then the doorbell rings. It's her young boyfriend who has returned because he misses her. He refuses to leave and even starts barking like a dog outside the window. To avoid drawing attention, Willa rolls Loudon's body in a rug. Covered in blood, the young boyfriend assumes it's just paint. It's a bit curious. Doesn't the room smell like blood? Or is the boyfriend's sense of smell just off? As the two prepare to get intimate, Willa notices that Loudon's body has twitched. She quickly makes an excuse to send the boyfriend away and proceeds to viciously kick her husband's head. To destroy the evidence quickly, she tricks her boyfriend into helping her load the rug into the car and then takes the body to her husband's soap factory. The moment she opens the trunk, Loudon miraculously comes back to life. Willa grabs his head and repeatedly strikes it, ensuring that he's truly dead like a piece of shit before throwing him into the soap ingredients. She calmly starts the machine, watching as her husband's body is crushed, mixed, and turned into a whole box of soap. Willa takes the husband's soap home and places it in the sink, planning to take a bath before disposing of the rest of the evidence. After a long day, she's covered in sweat, but midway through her bath, she realizes the soap has run out. Without thinking, she grabs another bar of her husband's soap and mockingly says, "Here's a chance for him to join her in the naked bath." But as she continues, Willa begins to feel a sharp pain all over her body, and her skin begins to slowly dissolve. It turns out she forgot that Luden's excessive stomach acid had become so severe that he required large amounts of medication. The soap, now contaminated with his medicine, is eating away at her. Willa eventually succumbs to her corrosive fate in the bath, paying the ultimate price for her promiscuity, cruelty, and malice. The 15th story begins with Lou, who is the CEO of a company, and he's just complimented a female subordinate for presenting a plan that saved the entire company. The woman, thrilled, shares her advertising proposal with him. At that moment, Lou's wife calls, and the sound of her voice shocks him. Just a few hours ago, he had hired a hitman to kill his wife, yet here she is, alive and furious, threatening to call the police. What's going on? Why did Lou want his wife dead? In a panic, Lou speeds back home, and as he drives, he begins his confession. Lou has struggled in this city for over a decade. In his younger days, he was involved in theft, robbery, and even murder. One day, after making enough money, he went to a plastic surgeon and changed his appearance, opting for a face like the famous actor Humphrey Bogart. With his new look, Lou used his accumulated wealth to turn his life around and eventually became a successful CEO. However, Lou's wife somehow came into possession of old photos of him before his transformation, revealing his criminal past. Lou was once a wanted fugitive, and if he were caught, not only would he be in trouble, but his plastic surgeon would be as well. To cover up their tracks, the doctor suggested that Lou hire a hitman to kill his wife and stage it as a robbery gone wrong. The plan seemed solid, but unfortunately the hitman failed, and now Lou's wife was even angrier, threatening to call the police. The flashback ends as Lou arrives home. To protect himself, he grabs his handgun, only to find a body lying in the corner of the living room. Before he can react, the body sits up. It's his plastic surgeon. The surgeon had been holding him hostage, and to Lou's shock, his wife was in on it. The doctor and Lou's wife had secretly been working together to set him up. The two of them forced Lou to write a suicide note to make it look like he took his own life. That way, his wife could inherit his fortune and run off with her lover. Determined to escape, Lou grabs a bottle of liquor from the table, rearranges himself for the moment, and while the doctor isn't looking, he kicks over a coffee table, seizing the opportunity to grab the doctor's gun. But Lou overlooked his wife. She picked up a statue from behind and began repeatedly smashing it into his head, killing him in the process. The doctor, sensing that Lou's pulse was gone and his eyes wide open in death, realized that Lou's soul hadn't left his body. He was still stuck, watching helplessly as the two lovers disposed of his body. As they moved his body, the doorbell rang. It was Lou's beautiful female subordinate arriving to discuss work. In a panic, the doctor hurriedly shoved Lou's body into the wardrobe. From inside the wardrobe, Lou could see his wife and the doctor forcibly pushing the subordinate out of the door. The sharp-eyed wife, sensing something between Lou and the subordinate, cursed at his body, claiming she could feel the affair. The doctor covered Lou's face with a hat and stuffed him into the back of the car. In truth, Lou's wife wasn't wrong. He and the subordinate had indeed been having an affair. The subordinate was kind and gentle, while his wife, in comparison, was nothing more than a loud, abrasive woman. Time passed, and eventually the doctor removed the hat from Lou's face. They had arrived in a remote area, and the doctor and his wife were digging a hole to bury him. Just then, the female subordinate, armed with a gun, crawled out of the trunk. It turned out that she had sensed something was wrong between the wife and the doctor, so she had secretly hidden in the trunk. Lou's death deeply saddened his lover, and while pointing the gun at the treacherous duo, she called the police. However, what she didn't know was that Lou's wife had a gun hidden on her. The wife, catching her off guard, shot the subordinate dead and sent her to be Satan's mistress. The bullet tore through the subordinate's body and the car's windshield, ripping into Lou's chest and breaking his spine. Lou's lifeless body slumped forward, and the car, still running, plowed directly into them, killing them instantly as they stood in front of it, unable to escape. Time passed, and eventually, the police arrived at the scene. They removed Lou's body from the vehicle. Lou noticed that the car had crashed into the grave the two had dug for him, and a wave of unspoken satisfaction washed over him. The police placed Lou's body into a body bag, but he did not see the legendary white light, which is said to guide the dead to heaven or hell. This meant that after death, the soul doesn't leave the body, and it can still feel pain. For Lou, the real suffering was about to begin with the autopsy. And so, the drama of Season 6 comes to an end. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.